Hello, returnees. Not internees, but returnees. Folks who are outside of the room, would you mind coming back? We're really excited for the second half of the conference. We're going to have one fascinating presentation, and then we got these two breakout sessions that are going to be led by folks who theoretically are experts in these fields. One is on homelessness and poverty, and the other one is women and poverty. The folks who are interested in homelessness and poverty will be in room 214. I'll be one of those alleged experts. There'll be two of us. And folks interested in women and poverty, you just have to stay here. And we'll give you some more information. I just wanted to set it up. We hope that we'll have something around an hour of a total presentation and Q&A, and then we'll break out, and we will do our very best to end by about 3:30, so that you have a sense of what our timeline is. What I'd like to do to begin our formal presentation is to invite one of my good friends and colleagues, Dr. Stephen Tripodi, to make the introduction.
Good afternoon. As Dr. Gamori said, I'm Stephen Tripodi. I'm a faculty member here at the FSU College of Social Work. I am the doctoral program director, and I'm also the associate director for the Institute for Justice Research and Development. And I am honored to be here today to introduce my very good friend and colleague, Dr. Carrie Pettus-Davis, founding director of the Institute for Justice Research and Development. I'm honored because Carrie has been incredibly inspirational to my career in general and to my research agenda in particular. Even when I was a faculty member and she was a doctoral student up in Chapel Hill, and she basically helped me get a project approved and was vital in having it come to fruition, a really large research project at a women's prison up there. Carrie has spent her entire adult life working in issues of prisoner reentry, starting when she was an undergraduate student at the University of Kansas, working in prisons up there, including the Leavenworth Federal Prison. As a master's student at the University of Kansas, she developed a prisoner reentry program. As a PhD student at the University of North Carolina, she developed another prisoner reentry program that really helped people released from prison improve their social support. And she conducted a randomized control trial to assess its effectiveness. And she has continued to develop prisoner reentry programs at Washington University in St. Louis, and now here at Florida State University College of Social Work. She has more than a decade of experience in conducting randomized control trials to figure out how to best help people released from prison. She has truly dedicated her life to this mission, which is what I find so inspirational. Moreover, since Carol Edwards mentioned the grand challenges this morning, Carrie is the co-leader of the grand challenge on promoting smart decarceration. And what I find most inspirational about Carrie, despite all of her success and all of her challenging and large and innovative randomized control trials and models that she has developed, is her passion for helping this disadvantaged population, underserved population of people released from prison, which of course are largely people that are experiencing poverty. Please welcome Carrie Pettus-Davis.
Stephen, I need to bring you with me. Wherever I go talk, that was an awesome introduction and I appreciate it. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you had a wonderful lunch, and I'm glad Many of you stayed around to talk about poverty and criminal justice. I want to start off with a story. So this story happened here in Florida, South Florida, when I was in a taxi cab, and apparently I'm the last person in the country that takes taxis, but I was really glad I was in the taxi this day, and the gentleman driving the taxi asked me what I was doing, and I said, well, I'm here to talk about criminal justice reform, and he immediately dismissed me, and he said, well, that's not going to happen. And I said, well, tell me a little bit about why you say that. And he said, well, the system's stacked up against them. I was a parole officer, he says. And then he started getting choked up. And he said, and there was this one guy that I just can't get out of my head. And I said, well, you know, what happened? And he said, well, this guy, he was an addict. That was the taxi driver's language. And he went in and out of prison his whole life. But this last time when he came out, he got things right. He was going to church, he was going to AA, he was reconnected with his children, he was supporting his wife, he was working multiple jobs, he was doing everything right. He had finally gotten on the right path. And then he said, a year into his probation, we had to go back before the judge. And the judge asked me, Mr. Parole Officer, has Mr. Jones been meeting all the conditions of parole? And the taxi driver says, I couldn't lie to the judge, and he hadn't. He hadn't been paying his supervision fees. And he hadn't been paying his supervision fees because he couldn't afford it, even though he was working all these jobs. And so that gentleman went back to prison that day for 10 years. And he said, the next day, I went to work and turned in my resignation, and I've been driving this taxi ever since. And I said, well, how long ago was that? And he said, 10 years. So what happened with this guy that he was talking about is he was too poor to remain outside of the criminal justice system. The only reason why he went back was because he was poor. Because incarceration in the United States is a stratifying institution by economic lines. So poor people in the United States experience incarceration differently than everybody else. And what we know about incarceration is that criminal behavior is not the strongest predictor of criminal justice involvement. Race and economic status is. And we have a lot of people who are incarcerated. So many of you might be familiar with this curve, or this graph, which shows the trajectory of mass incarceration in the United States. And I could probably teach an entire course on all the societal factors and the policy factors that contributed to mass incarceration. But as it relates to poverty, one of the things that we know is during this same period from 1980 to 2004, there was economic growth in the United States. Poverty had an opportunity to decline, but it didn't. And it didn't decline because of mass incarceration, and this has been empirically established. Instead, what people have been able to identify by multiple poverty indicators is that poverty would have declined by 20 more points, by 2.8 percentage points, or 2.8 percentage points, had mass incarceration not have happened. And the amount of incarceration that we do in the United States is unique. So the United States out-incarcerates every other country in the world. That means that we have 25% of the imprisoned population of human beings around the world, even though we only make up 5% of the world's population. And we out-incarcerate people by a lot, by hundreds of people per 100,000. So today we're going to talk a little bit about how economic disparities contribute to somebody becoming incarcerated, and how incarceration ensures that people stay in poverty after the experience. So here, this graph just shows you how many people are incarcerated in the United States. This is from 2016. You can see the majority of people are in our state and federal prisons. And I'm going to just go ahead and give you the bottom line because I'm a kind of a bottom line person, so you'll know where we're headed, and then I'll start to unpack it a little bit. So basically, economic bias contributes to people getting into the system, and then significant social disadvantage occurs as a result of being in the system. And then that economic burden that happens as a result of being in the criminal justice system is spread to families that people are embedded in. And most people who experience incarceration are embedded in families. And then those families contribute to persistent poverty in their communities. Oh, let me go back for a second. Just in case not everybody's familiar with all the segments of our criminal justice system, we have law enforcement, courts, where judges make decisions, prosecution, public defense, and supervision, which occurs in all these different places that I showed you: local jails, state prisons, federal prisons, and then community parole and probation. So we're going to walk through this system a little bit and talk about where the biases are occurring, and then ultimately, my favorite part, is we'll talk about potential solutions, which there are lots that we can be doing. So economic disparities. So prior to incarceration, incarcerated people have overall approximately 52%, men have 52% lower median annual income than those who are not incarcerated or have not experienced incarceration, and women about 42%. And this difference between those who have experienced incarceration and those who have not upholds across race and ethnic groups that are overrepresented in our criminal justice system. What this chart is showing you, and I know, Tommy, I'm not supposed to get out from behind the podium, but I'm going to do it just for 1 second. So what this chart shows you is that among incarcerated people, this was lower than $22,000 a year. Among incarcerated people, about 57% lie here. Non-incarcerated people, around 23%. So this is your highest income bracket, and this is your highest income bracket. Incarcerated people, non-incarcerated people at incarceration. So this is not after or during incarceration. This is at incarceration. This chart is for men. This chart is for women. You can see that the disparity ends up becoming even greater among women for annual incomes. And I want to talk about, because when people see this, one of the first things, let me go back to the slide for a second. One of the first things people might jump to, one of the conclusions they might jump to when they see this is say, oh, well, that's because poverty causes crime. But if you remember something that I said previously, the greatest predictor of incarceration is not criminal behavior, right? It's economic status and race. So studies have consistently examined this notion of, does poverty cause crime? The research is mixed in terms of there being correlations between individual behavior and crime and individual experiences of poverty. And when I say mixed, that's over the past 50 years of research. Most of that research falling on the side on poverty does not cause crime. There's some recent research that actually came out of FSU that found and was intentionally examining how do we understand this relationship between poverty and crime and delinquency in a little bit more of a complex way. And what they looked at was family poverty and delinquency engagement. And what they found is even family poverty only very weakly predicts engagement, an individual's engagement in delinquent or criminal behavior. But when they started to look at community poverty, so when community poverty that families of poverty were living in were one standard deviation above the mean, the effect of family poverty on delinquency doubles. When community poverty is 2 standard deviations above the mean, the effect of family poverty on individual delinquent behavior quadruples. So what this means, right, is that communities matter. That when we're thinking about poverty, we have to think at a community level as well as individuals' experiences and the consequences for them. Now this graph right here is really just a visual aid, so don't try to interpret it. But what I was trying to show here is that not only can poverty be concentrated in community, but incarceration rates are highly concentrated in community, which takes me to my next point, which is starting to look at what is the question that we should be asking instead of poverty and crime connection is what is the poverty and criminal justice connection? And we know some things about that. First of all, poverty over the last 40 years has become over-criminalized. People talk about it as the criminalization of poverty. So what am I talking about there? People can get arrested for loitering, for sleeping outside, for camping, for sleeping in vehicles. So basically, people are arrested for being poor. They're arrested for being homeless. We have over-policing in our poorest communities. So our poorest communities tend to have the most amount of police watching and waiting to catch people on something, maybe even sleeping in their car with their family. We have excessive amounts of fines and fees that lead to incarceration. So when I'm talking to family members about work, which I almost never try to do, by the way, just because it's a complex topic, but they can't understand that people actually go to jail for burning leaves in their yard without a permit. People actually go to jail for having their grass too long. And people actually go to jail for rolling through a stop sign accidentally. And why are they going to jail for these things? Because they get a fine. Right? They get a fine for whatever, burning their leaves, letting their grass grow too long. And then when they can't they can't pay the fine, they get a consequence. And that consequence is usually correctional supervision in the community. And then with correctional supervision, you have supervision fees. Being under supervision is not free. Going to prison is not free. People pay to go to prison. They pay for room and board. People pay to get supervised by a probation officer and a parole officer, and that's in both public and private systems. Private systems being far worse, of course, in the amount of fees that people charge. So people end up getting incarcerated and costing our systems, our government, lots of money, by the way, way more than the $100 citation they got for burning leaves. And then we also have public defenders system, right, to represent people who can't afford their own private attorneys. And public defenders are incredibly overburdened. They don't have time. They have the will, and almost all of them have the will to try to best represent people, but when you have hundreds on your caseload, they don't have the time to provide the best representation. So people who cannot afford an attorney, who cannot buy their best defense, have worse outcomes. They end up plea bargaining, and they plea bargain to jail. And then when they're in jail, even though they're not violent, they're not a threat to the community, this has absolutely nothing to do with public safety. They can't get out because they can't afford bail. Many, many, many people, in some jurisdictions as much as 60 and 70% of people are in jail for $500. And they're in jail until when? Until the judge can see them. The judge is really busy with all those people that are burning leaves in their yard. So they'll be in there for months. And I mentioned the cost to our system, right? But think about the cost to that individual. 60% of people are employed prior to an incarceration experience. I know if somebody at my shop went to jail for a couple of months, I would at least have to replace them for a little while. And I have a dedication to keeping people employed that have incarceration histories. Most people would lose their job because they're incarcerated. Most people who are incarcerated have families, and when I say most, I'm talking about 80% of women and around 68% of men. So their children experience this consequence of poverty beyond the food insecurity, the housing instability, and the public health risk that already come along with being poor. And then, once a person gets out of incarceration, once a person no longer, has a felony conviction but has served their time, they experience a lifetime of collateral consequences. In many states, mandatory and permanent. There are 45,000 laws, public policies around the country that exclude people permanently from certain types of employment, that exclude people permanently from participating in their child's education, that exclude people permanently from having professional licensure that would bring them out of poverty, that they're fully capable of doing, but because of whatever the felony conviction was, no matter how minor the infraction, they're not able to get it. In many states, a felony comes at a $500, like you stole $500 worth of property. So any of our 19 and 20-year-old college students here that stole a $500 pair of sunglasses may not be able to become an accountant if they're poor and they can't afford their own private attorney anyway. When people get out of prison, they have to try to put back together government identification. You can't do anything without a government identification. And people have been locked behind bars, unable to make money, unable to establish their ID. And then to get your IDs, you have to have money, right? But you haven't had an opportunity to earn more than 25 cents a day in your best paying prisons. When people get out, they have supervision fees. We talked a little bit about that already. Thank you to our taxi driver. And then they have tons of supervision requirements in many states. You've got to be at parole office on this day at 3 o'clock. You got to go to court-mandated treatment. You've got to show up to the day reporting center. You have to do community service. Oh, you need to go look for jobs. Oh, you need transportation for the jobs that you can't afford to get the transportation to go. And when you're working, you can't come to supervision. And if you don't come to supervision meetings, then you go back to prison. It's stacked up against individuals, and it works to keep people in poverty. And it keeps their families in poverty too, or pushes them into it if they weren't there. When incarcerated men, this is a study on incarcerated men, I'm just not preferentially choosing them, but people after an incarceration experience have a 21% decline in odds of ever obtaining employment. They annually work almost 2 months, fewer weeks, 9 weeks. Sorry, I said that all weird, but you got my point. They have lower wages. They have a 40% reduction in lifetime earnings, and you saw how low their earnings were initially anyway because of the economic bias of people who end up in the criminal justice system. And that results in almost $200,000 after age 40 for incarcerated men. Family income, even innocent family members who didn't do any kind of felony conviction suffer. So family income of incarcerated people declined by 22% during a person's incarceration. And why might their income decline? Well, because usually their loved one was providing some monetary support. Usually they want to help, they want to see their loved one, they want to call their loved one, which costs $2 an hour. They want to travel to their loved one in prison that might be 3 to 9 to 12 hours away. They want to make sure that their loved one has a toothbrush and toilet paper and deodorant, which you also have to purchase in prison. This is not freely provided. They want to make sure they have food. They want to make sure that they can advocate for health care, quality health care, which sometimes requires a lot of phone calls and travel and advocacy. And then they take on their loved ones' debts and other financial obligations, especially if they're married. And after release, family incomes remain low. Most incarcerated individuals, once they get out, like I said, they haven't been earning money, they don't have any money, they depend on their families for every need, and that costs money. They have more legal obligations, sometimes child support, fees, and their own wages. The individual who gets out, their wages can get garnished. And if they're married, sometimes their spouse's wages can get garnished. So incarceration, our criminal justice system, is a stratifying institution along economic lines for who comes there, who leaves, and keeping them in poverty. And there are, like I said, my favorite part, solutions, lots and lots of feasible, realistic solutions. The ones that everybody want to talk about first are prevention, right? We've got to do more in our communities around prevention. We need better public school systems. We need more people staying in school. We need more mental health treatment. We need more substance abuse treatment. We need more opportunity in our communities, particularly our poorest communities. You might remember I talked about the impact of community poverty on family poverty, on individual delinquency. We need more social workers. I'm a social work professor, and less law enforcement officers. This is not an insult to law enforcement officers, but the Lyndon B. Johnson administration actually tried this approach, right? They infused social workers into communities. And as administrations changed, resources went away, law enforcement stayed, and social workers left. And incarceration skyrocketed, and poverty decline didn't make the progress that it could make. In the criminal justice system, we can do prevention too. There can be alternatives to fines and fees, but we've got to be very careful about unintended consequences. So let me give you an example. The first thing that many communities jump to when they want to do an alternative to a fine or fee for something ridiculous like burning your leaves, they say, well, we'll just have the individual do community service. Well, community service takes time away from work. Community service takes time away from families, from pursuing an education. Community service costs money because you have to drive somewhere or take a bus or otherwise have some form of transportation. So when we're thinking about alternatives, we have to totally reject anything that we've tried to date, and we have to look through it through a lens of economic burden, through a lens of trying to alleviate poverty, not make it worse. Community bail funds is another idea that has surfaced. And community bail funds operate where people who can't afford bail but are not a risk to their community are provided bail either by a philanthropic organization or by a public entity. This also has unintended consequences. Some people who committed crimes, minor crimes, that warranted some type of correctional supervision could have expired their sentence while they're waiting to go to court. Now, do I think I would want to wait in jail? No. But when you talk to people who have incarceration histories and you talk about mandatory community bail funds, a lot of them will say, oh, don't do that to me, please. I would be able to serve my time and have this over with. So I'm not saying community bail funds are good, community bail funds are bad. I think their community bail funds are probably overall good. We need the research to do it. But what I am saying is make sure that when we're thinking about solutions, that we're including people who have experienced what we're trying to solve for. Not only that we're including them, that we don't do things without them, without their voices. We need adequately resourced public defenders. Being in a capital city, you can do something about that. We can all demand adequately resourced public defenders. We also can and do, to some extent, have alternatives to criminal conviction. And prosecutors can lead the way in this if they're willing, and some are, and if they understand what it means for our country. It has been proposed that poverty should be a consideration at sentencing. That just like factors of mental illness and substance abuse and trauma and opportunity in terms of education are considered at sentencing, that poverty should be considered at sentencing. We can remove supervision fees, especially if we have substantially less people in prison, especially if we have substantially less people under correctional supervision, because we aren't criminalizing poverty. Licensure, we don't need to have any person in the history of having felony convictions be excluded from being able to be an accountant or be able to be a plumber. There might be some people, say somebody had a lot of embezzling history, maybe shouldn't be an accountant, right? But somebody who had some other totally unrelated offense should have that opportunity. And driver's license, so I'm talking about professional licensure, but I'll also talk about driver's licenses. We have people in our communities, in this community, in communities around the country, that lose their driver's license for 18 or 20 years because of a drug or alcohol offense, even though they've been sober and never had any other type of crime since then. That's not good for that individual. It's not good for our communities. It's not good for alleviating poverty. Those 45,000 policies that I mentioned need an overhaul. These aren't policies that were just a part of our country from forever. These are policies that started proliferating in the 1980s and the 1990s, and they were modeled after a European practice known as civil death. Civil death. So the goal, that was a punishment approach, was for people to be removed from their communities or be able to be a part of their communities forever because of engaging in bad behaviors. And like I already mentioned, if we had substantially less incarceration, we would have substantially less problems. So thank you, and I'll open it up for questions.
So please feel free to come up to the microphones, and we'll try to, and I would request that you make your questions as brief as possible and as pointed as possible to allow our speaker to respond and to make sure that other people can also ask their questions. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for this presentation.
You're too tall.
I know, right? I'll just hold it. Thank you for this presentation. I knew that the justice system was highly stacked against those who are in poverty, but I didn't understand just the breadth of the situation. So thank you for this presentation. My question is, you mentioned that is things that we can do right here, especially because we live and work and go to school in the capital city, that we can do to change the situation. Mm-hmm. What are some very specific things, maybe 3 to 5 things that we can do right here in Tallahassee to try to change the situation?
Yeah. So the situation can get very overwhelming, right? Because there's so many problems, there's so many opportunities for solutions. So what I like to recommend for people is that they figure out 1 or 2 of those areas, those solution areas, or even the problem areas that I mentioned, and dig in really deep on that. So for example, there is a major push in Florida and in other places around the country around removing fines and fees. There's legislative advocacy and activity going on along that. So if that was one that you were really passionate about, I would try to find out who in your community is leading that group or that work, and then connect with them. But it's really about finding the one issue and then finding out who is doing, and then engage with them, because there are major advocacy efforts happening all over Florida, happening in Tallahassee, led by a diverse range of groups that you could pair up with.
For situations like those who perform DUI and DWI multiple times, would it be more sensible to just have like interlock devices and that sort of thing in requiring them to go through substance abuse instead of incarceration?
Right. It's an easier answer when they haven't hurt somebody, right? So I think DUIs are a really complicated one. I don't know the answer. I think it's a community question to struggle with. But I think your solution that you proposed in there, which is about really taking advantage of technology and the significant advances that we've had in technology to do anything other than incarceration when at all possible, then we should pursue that. Yes, sir.
Yes. I think you lay out a good case for the fact that we have a criminal injustice system. And I'd like you to kind of comment on the idea of restorative justice that looks at, rather than justice meaning retribution, justice being the fair restoration of community commitment and values.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought up that. I think we could learn a lot from other countries that have gone through truth and reconciliation panels. I think we need some restorative justice that occurs very much so at the community level, because we have destroyed communities, we have destroyed families, we have destroyed individuals by our practices. In terms of individuals who have engaged in crime that has victimized other people, we have figured that out a little bit at the juvenile justice level. I think there's an enormous way to go to figure it out at the adult level. But if we could look at it from the same lens of using everything else but incarceration first, I think it would force our hands to try to get creative and to try to figure out how to make people whole. Because if you think about it, incarceration is lazy.
And to move forward with that idea that incarceration is lazy, I'm a clinician as well as a professor in social work, and one of the things that I noticed in clinical work is there's a joke that when somebody is violent or have done certain crimes, that they'll say, they're off their meds. And so one of the things that I look at and was thinking about when you were talking was this intersectionality between, minor infractions of the law, mental health concerns, and the justice system. Because I think that sometimes we exclude people who may be medicated and they're fine when they're medicated, but then when they're not, they can't afford those medications, they're back in the other institution that has been set up for that kind of situation. Please address that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I laid out a lot of solutions that are feasible and relatively low-hanging fruit, but I do not want to give the impression that nobody engages in crime and serious crime or anything like that. So one of the things that I thought of when you were talking about, when you were asking your question and talking about that, is that a pursuit that we're going on right now with some collaborators around the country is looking at prosecution as a critical intercept in the criminal justice system to prevent exacerbation of behavioral health symptoms. So with mental health specifically, once we start pushing people into the criminal justice system, we start making their symptomatology worse, we start destabilizing, we start agitating, we get them further away from treatment, and we make it more likely, right, that something's going to go wrong. So if we started using our decision makers who decide whether a person goes to an alternative outside of the criminal justice system instead of into the criminal justice as a behavioral health intervention point, I don't think you would have to see that as much. Yeah. Yes,
Hey,
sir.
thanks for your presentation. And first of all, do you have all your statistics written down?
Yeah.
Secondly, I noticed when we were talking about solutions, you didn't deal with infrastructure for those that are getting out of prison, like transitional housing and those sorts of things. Will you address that?
Absolutely. And so, Nicole, I got busted. So we were riding over here, and I said, dang it, I forgot my references slide. So I will add the references slide and make sure that anybody who wants it could get it, because those are not my statistics, right? They're other researchers' statistics. So thank you for asking that question. I thought I almost got away with it. In terms of infrastructure, you know, what you bring up is critically important, and it's a very timely question for me, because we have this large trial going on with 1,500 people getting out of prison in Kentucky, Florida, Texas, and Pennsylvania, across 12 rural and urban communities. And one of the things that we are really seeing very loud and clear is that the lack of structural supports, places where people can live, places where people can get to be able to work, to be able to access support that they need, seem to be impacting their outcomes above and beyond any best intention they have and any access to services they have. Because this quilt of collateral consequences that I mentioned work against rehabilitative principles. They work against people being able to succeed. So one of the things that I am starting to propose to the world, and I have an opportunity to say it off paper right now, I've been writing it on paper, is that we have to think about recidivism differently. Recidivism is used as a measure of individual behavior, but it does not function that way. Recidivism is a measure of lack of infrastructure, lack of support, and system-level decision-making, including correctional agents, interacting with individual decisions, individual behavior. So recidivism is not a measure of how a person performs after prison in the absence of all those other things.
Can you give some examples of some specific examples of some forward-thinking alternatives to incarceration, and then also with privatization of prisons, especially I guess in Florida, is there any real incentive to maybe keep people from going to prison? Have you come across that?
Yeah, so let me start with the privatization of prisons, and then I'll move to the second question. I think so this is not the academic, this is a personal opinion right at the moment. I think making a profit off of caging people is morally corrupt. I find it repulsive. But private prisons, I won't want to say a but, I'm going to say an and private prisons do not control or influence who comes to them. Our sentencing structures do. Our law enforcement officers do. Our prosecutors do. Our judges do. I would be happy if all private prisons were gone, and I'd be fine if they're gone. But they're not controlling who's coming in to the system, nor are they controlling who's coming out of the system, outside of lobbying efforts. I knew you were going to say that.
That's just it. I mean, their influence and their power. I mean, you know, it's one thing to have a voice, it's another thing to have a checkbook. And so is that causing any pushback from trying some of these progressive measures or any of these alternatives?
I am sure it is. I do not hang out with private prison lobbyists, so I don't know what they say behind closed doors. And I'm not saying that to be nasty. Like, I mean, I really don't know what they say, but I am absolutely sure that it creates some kind of resistance. But I also think that we, as community members, contribute to their success if we're not giving an alternative message. If we're not saying We want something totally different. This is not okay. So I think we have to take some responsibility if we don't do anything to counteract them. In terms of some innovative alternatives to incarceration, and I cringe a little bit when I say alternatives to incarceration, and the reason that is because I want us to imagine everything else but incarceration. I want us to think of that as not even an option. I'm not an abolitionist of incarceration, but I do think it should be reserved for only really extreme situations. But there are a lot of alternatives that are happening in prosecutors' offices where prosecutors are choosing to defer people away from the system, to not charge them, to not request a plea, or when they do request a plea, to allow them to reverse that plea at a later point. There's also some really creative community-wide efforts in Oregon and Washington, where the mental health system, the substance abuse treatment providers, the law enforcement officers, the courts, the public defenders, the prosecutors are all intentionally collaborating to keep as many people out of the system as possible. We actually had a police officer that's leading that initiative speak at one of our conferences. It was just phenomenal. I just wanted to take him everywhere and have him talk to people. So there are a lot of communities that are making progress. There's just not enough. We need to highlight as many of those as possible. There's also family training programs now to help families understand how to advocate for their loved one as they go through each stage of the system. Yes, sir.
Are you familiar with the prison entrepreneurial program in Huntsville, Texas?
Yes, I am. We actually are in one of the prisons that they're in.
Cool. Yeah, I volunteered in that. It was great. It was wonderful.
It's a great way to help people move out of poverty. So since you didn't describe it, I'll describe it a little bit. So the Prison Entrepreneur program actually teaches people while they're incarcerated to become entrepreneurs, to how to come up with their own business plan, get them the skills to do the business plan. And there's a lot of volunteers that are successful businessmen and women that come in and will work with them. And it's my understanding it's a really intensive program, and that people tend to be very successful when they get out. The downside is sometimes some licensure and certification, not to the program, but to our society, is that we still have these public barriers that will work up against them. All right, well, thank you, everybody, for wonderful questions.